Why would a grief-hardened Wyoming rancher risk a noose to carry a legless Shoshone warrior from a death drift, hide her beneath his floorboards, and kiss her under a sky of ice while bounty men circle and the law knocks unless the silence he kept for 5 years was hiding a deadlier secret? The silence of a Wyoming winter is a different kind of quiet. It's not empty. It's heavy. It's the weight of a foot of snow pressing down on the world, muffling sound, until all you can hear is the beat of your own blood in your ears, and the whisper of the wind as it scours the plains. For 5 years, that silence had been my only companion. It had settled into the bones of this cabin, into the marrow of my own. My name is Elias Thorne, and I was a man who had made peace with ghosts. The fire that took my Sarah and little Mara had burned the sound out of my world. Laughter, chatter, the simple melody of a life shared, it all went up in smoke, leaving behind the cold ash of memory. I'd fought in the war, seen men torn apart, but nothing prepared me for the quiet that followed. So I kept to myself on this stretch of land. The government granted me a place as broken and isolated as my own soul. The folks in Centennial Valley, what few there were, called me the Hermit of Thorn Ridge. They weren't wrong. I worked my small herd, fixed my fences, and stared out at the unforgiving beauty of the Laramie Mountains, waiting for nothing in particular. That day, the cold had a special kind of bite. A fresh blizzard had swept through the night before draping a new pristine blanket over the landscape. It was the kind of cold that froze the breath in your lungs and made the trees crackle like gunfire. 3 of my heifers, spooked by the storm, had broken through a weak spot in the north fence. Tracking them was a miserable, necessary chore. I saddled my gelding Jericho, a creature as stoic and weathered as I was, and rode out my rifle snug in its scabbard. The tracks were clear in the fresh powder, leading me toward a narrow wooded ravine at the base of the ridge. It was a place I usually avoided, a tangle of ancient pines and jagged rock that always felt older and sadder than the rest of the land. As I neared the edge of the trees, Jericho stopped dead. His ears swiveled, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He was listening to something I couldn't hear. I stilled myself, scanning the shadows. The silence was absolute. Then I saw it. A smudge of color against the blinding white. A dark, unnatural shape half buried in a snowdrift beneath a gnarled pine. My first thought was a wolf kill, maybe one of my strays. I dismounted, my hand instinctively going to the colt at my hip, and moved forward, my boots crunching a loud protest against the quiet. The closer I got, the more the scene resolved itself into a nightmare. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. A woman. She lay twisted on her side, a tattered duskin dress doing little to shield her from the elements. Her black hair was fanned out against the snow, dusted with ice crystals. The snow around her lower body was stained a sickening frozen crimson. For a moment I was sure she was dead. Another soul lost to the brutal indifference of this land. I stood there, a strange hollowness echoing in my chest. I should have turned back, ridden away. A dead Indian wasn't my business. In this territory, getting involved was a good way to get yourself killed, but something held me there. Maybe it was the memory of another body I'd found too late. I took another step, crouching down. Her face was wax and her lips a faint blue. She was Shoshone, reckoned from the beadwork on what was left of her dress. Then I saw the source of the blood. Below her knees, her legs were gone. The stumps were crudely wrapped in hide, the bindings frozen stiff and dark with blood. It was a butchery, but a desperate one, meant to save a life, not take one. And as I stared, a faint, almost imperceptible cloud of vapor escaped her lips. She was alive. The knowledge hit me like a physical blow. A living, breathing problem lay half dead at my feet. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. She was one of them. My own countrymen were fighting her people not 50 miles from here. Bringing her back was an act of treason in some eyes, suicide in others. She would bring trouble, the kind that arrives with soldiers and marshals. I straightened up my mind, a storm of conflict. Leave her. It's the smart thing to do. It's the safe thing to do. She's probably dead by now anyway. I took a step back toward Jericho. He watched me, his dark eyes knowing. The wind whispered through the pines, a mournful, lonely sound. It sounded like Sarah's name. I looked back at the woman, at the faint rise and fall of her chest, at the sheer impossible fact of her survival. She had fought to stay alive, and the world had left her to freeze. My own ghosts rose up, then whispering of failure, of helplessness, of fires I couldn't stop. I couldn't save my wife. I couldn't save my daughter. But this woman, she wasn't dead yet. With a curse that was more a prayer, I turned back. Damn it all, I muttered to the uncaring sky. I holstered my pistol, bent down, and slid my arms under her. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of cold limbs and fierce, stubborn life. As I lifted her, her eyes fluttered open. They weren't hazy or pleading. They were dark, deep, and utterly defiant. In their depths I saw a flicker of the same cold fury I saw in my own reflection on quiet nights. She looked at me not as a savior but as a final judgment. I held her against my chest, her cold seeping through my coat, and carried her to Jericho. Getting her onto the saddle in front of me was a clumsy, difficult affair. She groaned once, a low, guttural sound of pure agony, but didn't make another peep. I wrapped my oilskin coat around her as best I could, and urged Jericho into a slow, careful walk back to the cabin. The silence was broken now, filled with the ragged sound of her breathing, and the frantic, unfamiliar beat of my own heart. I was no longer a man at peace with his ghosts. I had just invited a living one into my home. The journey back was a torment of slow, deliberate steps. Each jarring motion of the horse seemed to pull a fresh wave of pain from her, though she remained unnervingly silent, her body tense and rigid in my arms. The cabin, when it finally came into view, looked less like a home and more like a fortress. Against the encroaching dusk, a single block of weathered pine with a plume of smoke from the banked fire I'd left that morning. Inside, the warmth was a shock to the system. I carried her straight to my cot, the one Sarah had insisted we buy, with its horsehair mattress and sturdy iron frame. I laid her down as gently as I could. Her eyes, sharp and lucid, now tracked my every move, taking in the sparse room, the stone fireplace, the shelves lined with tins and a few worn books, the pair of rifles resting on pegs by the door. She was cataloging threats, assessing her cage. There was no time for deliberation. The bindings on her legs were a frozen, bloody mess. If infection hadn't already taken hold, it soon would. I stoked the fire, put a kettle of water on to boil, and ripped clean strips from one of Sarah's old linen sheets I kept packed away in a trunk. My hands, usually steady when field dressing a calf or mending tack, felt clumsy and thick. When I approached the cot with the hot water and cloths, her body went taut. A low hiss escaped her lips, a sound more animal than human. "I have to," I said, my voice a rough croak from disuse, "or you'll die." Her dark eyes held mine, and in them I saw no fear, only a bottomless well of hate. Not for me, I realized. For her fate. For her helplessness. After a long moment, she gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Untying the frozen knots was a grim task. The hide was stiff, and I had to use my knife to carefully cut them away. The flesh beneath was angry and swollen, a raw, brutal testament to the violence she'd endured. The cold had likely saved her, slowing the bleeding and the spread of poison. But now the thawing began, and with it a new level of agony. I cleaned the wounds as best I could with hot water and a tincture of pine sap and willow bark I kept for the livestock. She never cried out. Her breath hitched, her knuckles went white where she gripped the blanket, but she bore it with a stoicism that shamed me. Her control was absolute, a wall of ice against the fire of her pain. I packed the wounds with a salve and wrapped them in the clean linen. When I was done, I was sweating despite the chill in the room. I pulled a thick wool blanket over her, tucking it around her shoulders. She had already lapsed into a feverish state, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. For the rest of the night, I sat in the chair across the room, the rifle across my lap, watching her. I wasn't guarding against her. I was guarding her. From what I wasn't sure. The world, I supposed. The ghosts. My own damn weakness. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, I watched the rise and fall of her chest, a fragile rhythm in the crushing silence of my life. This woman was a splinter under my skin, a dangerous, unwelcome intrusion. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that nothing would ever be the same. She woke before dawn, her movement, a subtle shift under the blankets. I'd been dozing in my chair, the fire burned down to glowing embers. I watched as she reached down her hand, exploring the empty space where her legs should have been. Her body went rigid. No tears, no sound, just a sudden violent stillness. It was the quiet grief of a limb that still screamed its presence, a ghost in the flesh. I rose and moved about the cabin, making noise to let her know I was awake. I stoked the fire, put coffee on to boil. When I brought a bowl of thin broth to the bedside, she stared at me, her eyes hollowed out by pain and exhaustion. She didn't reach for the bowl. "Drink," I said. It was an order, not a request. She just watched me, her gaze unwavering. I set the bowl on the crate beside the cot. "Your choice." I turned and walked away, giving her the dignity of that small rebellion. A few minutes later, I heard the faint clink of the spoon against the tin bowl. The days that followed fell into a harsh, unspoken routine. I'd tend to my duties outside the cold, a welcome distraction, a pain I could understand. When I came in, I'd clean and dress her wounds. She never fought me, but her silence was a weapon, a shield she used to keep me at a distance. I learned to read the tightening of her jaw, the subtle flinch of her shoulders. On the third day, I returned from the barn to find her on the floor. She had tried to get to the water bucket, dragging herself with her arms, her face a mask of sweat-drenched determination. The linen bandages were soiled, and a fresh line of blood had seeped through. "What in God's name are you doing?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. She glared up at me from the floorboards, her chest heaving. "I will not rot in that bed." Each word was a struggle. I saw it then, clear as day. The fire in her. It wasn't the flickering ember of a dying creature. It was the steady hot flame of a warrior. It was pride. It was a refusal to be broken. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years, a deep, grudging respect. Without another word, I lifted her. She was surprisingly light but solid with muscle. I placed her back on the cot, ignoring the heat of her glare. That night I didn't sleep. I went to the barn, and by the light of a single lantern I worked. I took apart an old freight crate and the broken runners of a sled. I planed the wood, sanded it smooth, and fashioned a low, flat cart just wide enough for her to sit on. I added small wooden wheels I'd carved for a toy wagon for Mara, a project I'd never finished. I padded the top with a piece of old saddle blanket. It was crude, but it was functional. It was a chance. The next morning I brought it inside and set it on the floor beside the cot. She stared at it, her expression unreadable. Her eyes traced its simple lines, the scuffed wood, the small uneven wheels. A long moment passed. Then her gaze lifted to meet mine. "You made this," she stated, her voice raspy. I just shrugged. "You said you wouldn't rot." A flicker of something, not gratitude, not yet, but maybe understanding, crossed her face. She reached out a hand and touched the edge of the wood. "I do not take charity," she said, her voice low and fierce, a warning. "It ain't charity," I replied, my voice equally quiet. "It's a tool, like a shovel or an axe. What you do with it is up to you." That day she began to move. It was a brutal, exhausting process. Getting from the cot to the cart was a battle. Pushing herself across the floor with her hands was a war. She fell twice, her curses sharp and bitter in the quiet cabin. I didn't help her. I knew instinctively that offering help would be the deepest insult. I just stayed nearby, mending a bridle, sharpening a knife, a silent witness to her struggle. By evening, she had made it from the cot to the fireplace and back. Her palms were raw, her body trembling with exhaustion, but her eyes held a spark of triumph. She had bent the world to her will, if only by a few feet. That night, as I banked the fire, she spoke from the darkness of the cot. "You have a name, quiet man." I paused, my back to her. The question was a crack in the wall of silence between us. "Elias," I said. I heard her repeat it, a soft whisper in the dark. "Elias." I left her then, stepping out into the biting cold of the porch. The stars were scattered across the black sky like chips of ice. For the first time since I'd found her, I felt a tremor of fear. The silence in my cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of a woman as broken and stubborn as I was, and I had no idea what to do with it. The thaw between us was as slow and grudging as the coming of a Wyoming spring. It wasn't a single event, but a series of small, almost imperceptible shifts. It was in the way she no longer flinched when I brought the bowl of stew, or the way her eyes would follow me as I moved about the cabin, no longer with suspicion, but with a quiet, assessing curiosity. Her strength grew daily. Soon the low cart I had built was in constant motion, the scrape of its wooden wheels. A new familiar sound in the cabin's silence. She learned the geography of the room by hand power, developing a rhythm for navigating around the table, for reaching the lower shelves where I'd begun to store her water and food. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and strong. She was reclaiming her world, one painful push at a time. One evening, as I sat by the fire carving a new handle for a hatchet, she broke the comfortable silence. "You were a soldier," she said. It wasn't a question. I didn't look up from my work, the knife shaving away a curl of hickory. A long time ago, blue coat or gray, I admitted a fact I rarely shared. For a cause I never much believed in. She was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. "And now you help one of my people." I finally looked at her. She was sitting in her cart by the hearth, the firelight catching the sharp planes of her face, the glint of the bear claw necklace she always wore. "That war is over," I said gruffly. "This is different." How she pressed. I sighed, setting the wood and knife aside. In the war, we were all just uniforms, just colors. Out here, I gestured vaguely at the dark windows. Out here, there are no uniforms. There's just people trying to survive the winter. She seemed to accept that, and the conversation ended. But she had opened a door. A few days later, she caught a fever. It came on fast and hard. One minute she was arguing with me about the best way to skin a rabbit. The next, she was shivering violently under a mountain of blankets, her skin burning to the touch. The wounds on her legs, which had been healing cleanly, were inflamed again. For 2 days I fought it. I forced willow bark tea between her chapped lips. I bathed her face and chest with cool water. I sat by her cot through the long dark nights, listening to her delirious whispers. She spoke in her own tongue, the words foreign to my ears but the tone universal. There was pain and loss, and a name she repeated over and over, Kyle. It sounded like a lament. On the second night, as the fever peaked, she thrashed in the bed, her hands clawing at the blankets. I knelt beside her, pinning her shoulders gently to keep her from harming herself. Her eyes flew open, but they didn't see me. They were seeing a ghost. Her hand shot out and gripped my arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. "Cale, no," she cried out in broken English. "Do not leave me." The name and the raw desperation in her voice hit me harder than I expected. This Cale, whoever he was, had been the one to leave her in that ravine. Her brother, I guessed. The one who had performed the brutal surgery that saved her life only to abandon her to die. The fever broke the next morning. She woke weak and drenched in sweat, but her eyes were clear. I was sitting in my chair, exhausted. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. I just nodded. "You're a stubborn woman to kill." A faint ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You are a stubborn man to run." Her recovery was slow, but the fever seemed to have burned away the last of her reserve. As she regained her strength, she began to talk. Not in a flood, but in small, carefully offered pieces. She told me her name was Anya. She spoke of her life before, of riding horses across the plains, of the respect she'd earned as a hunter, a warrior. She spoke of Cale, her younger brother, with a complex mix of love and a cold, unforgiving anger. "He did what he had to do," she said one afternoon, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. "Our war party was broken. The soldiers were coming. They could not carry me. A warrior who cannot stand is nothing." "You're not nothing," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. She looked at me, her dark eyes searching my face. "To my people, I am a ghost, a burden left behind for the spirits." "You're here," I said simply. "That's not nothing." I found myself sharing things in return. I told her about the farm in Missouri, about the war, about the weariness that had settled in my bones and never left. I didn't speak of Sarah or Mara. That wound was still too raw, a place I kept walled off even from myself. But Anya seemed to know. She never asked about a wife or family, but sometimes I'd catch her looking at the small faded bonnet hanging from a peg on the wall, the only thing of Mira's that had survived. She respected my silence just as I respected her scars. One afternoon she was attempting to mend her tattered dress. The fabric was too frayed, the task impossible. In frustration, she threw it aside. The movement exposed her shoulders and the top of her chest. She saw me glance over, then quickly look away. "Does my brokenness offend you, Elias?" she asked, her tone sharp, challenging. I set down the harness I was oiling and looked at her directly. Her gaze was fiery, daring me to pity her. "I see a woman," I said quietly. "A woman in pieces," she scoffed. "No," I said, holding her gaze. "Just a woman." Something in her expression softened. The fire in her eyes didn't die, but it banked, becoming a warm, steady glow. That night she didn't wrap the blanket so tightly around her shoulders. She didn't turn her face away when I came to tend to her wounds, and as I finished, my hand brushed her arm and she didn't pull away. The touch lingered in the cold air between us, a small spark in the darkness. The silence that fell afterward wasn't empty. It was filled with a new and terrifying possibility. It was the sound of a world beginning to thaw. The line between caretaker and companion blurred so slowly I didn't notice it happening. It was in the shared meals where the silence was no longer heavy but comfortable. It was in the way I started talking to her as I went about my chores, narrating my day without expecting a response, only to find her listening intently. It was in the way she would wait by the door for my return from the barn, her presence a silent, steady welcome. The winter held its grip on the land, but inside the cabin something was changing. I built a small table for her, one that was low enough for her to work at from her cart. She took to carving, using one of my smaller knives to shape pieces of bone and wood I brought in for her. Her hands were deft and sure, creating intricate figures of horses and eagles, their lines fluid and full of life. It was a language she spoke with her hands, a way of expressing the wildness that was still trapped inside her. One evening I asked her to come outside. "The world is too cold," she'd said, not looking up from a piece of antler she was carving. "The stars aren't," I replied. "And a woman shouldn't be afraid of the wind." She gave me a sharp look, then a slow nod. I bundled her in a thick buffalo robe, lifted her in my arms, an act that was becoming familiar, almost natural, and carried her out onto the porch. The night was brutally cold but magnificent. There was no moon, and the sky was a black velvet canvas shot through with a million diamond-sharp stars. The Milky Way stretched overhead in a vast, shimmering ribbon. We sat on the porch swing I'd built for Sarah, the robe wrapped around both of us. "My people say the stars are the campfires of the ancestors," she murmured, her breath a white cloud in the darkness. "They are watching us." "What do you think they see?" I asked. She was quiet for a long time. "Two broken people, hiding from the world," maybe I said. "Or maybe they see two people who survived." Her shoulder pressed against mine. It wasn't an accident. A current passed between us, a warmth that had nothing to do with the robe. "Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "have you ever touched a woman not out of duty, not out of pity?" My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned my head, and in the faint starlight I could see her face, her eyes searching mine. "I am not a ghost," she said, her voice fierce. "Do not treat me like one." "I don't," I managed, my own voice thick. Her hand, small and calloused, moved from beneath the robe and found mine. She guided my hand to her side, pressing my palm against the curve of her hip. The flesh was warm, alive. My fingers brushed against the thick, ropey scar tissue at the top of her thigh. She didn't flinch. She held my hand there, forcing me to acknowledge all of her, the smooth and the scarred. "I can't feel this like I used to," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But I still want to feel." She leaned in, and her lips found mine. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepened. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was a question, an affirmation, a bridging of two vast solitudes. It tasted of wood smoke and cold air, and a loneliness so profound it felt like coming home. When we broke apart, we were both breathless. "Are you sure?" I asked, the words rough. "I have never been more sure of anything," she answered. I lifted her again, carried her inside to the cot, my movements deliberate, almost reverent. The fire had burned low, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. She unwrapped the robe and let it fall away. Her body, bathed in the soft flickering light, was a landscape of scars and survival. She was beautiful in her imperfection, a testament to the strength of the human will. I undressed slowly, my own scars on display, a puckered mark on my shoulder from a Union bullet, the silvery lines on my back from the fire. She reached out and traced the scar on my ribs, her touch sending a shiver through me. "We are a matched pair, you and I," she murmured. That night we came together, not with the hunger of strangers, but with the quiet understanding of fellow survivors. It was a slow, gentle exploration, a reawakening of bodies that had long been dormant, closed off by grief and pain. It was an act of profound trust, a silent promise whispered in the language of touch. Afterward, we lay tangled in the blankets, her head resting on my chest, her hands spread over my heart. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin there was a profound stillness. "You could have left me in the snow," she whispered into the darkness. I pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulder, my arm holding her close. "Yes," I said. "I could have, but I hadn't." And in that simple, undeniable fact, a new world had been born. A world with a population of two, sheltered against the long, cold winter. The arrival of Silas Kane was as subtle as a razor blade to the throat. He didn't ride in like a storm. He drifted in like a bad smell on the wind. I'd felt him before I saw him, a prickling on the back of my neck for 2 days prior, the feeling of being watched. I'd seen a lone rider on the far ridge, a dark silhouette against the snow, too far to identify but close enough to be a threat. Anya felt it too. She grew quiet, her carving knife still, her eyes constantly scanning the cleared patch of land around the cabin. "A wolf circles before it attacks," she'd murmured one morning, "to learn the strength of the prey." He came on the 3rd day. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long blue shadows across the snow. I was splitting firewood near the barn, the rhythmic thud of the axe a comfort. Anya was on the porch, wrapped in her robe, her face turned to the weak winter sun. She was the one who saw him first. "Elias." Her voice was sharp, a blade of sound in the quiet air. I straightened the axe handle slick in my palm. A man on a lean, wiry horse was picking his way up the trail. He wasn't a rancher or a trapper. His clothes were too clean, his saddle too new. A navy colt was tied low on his hip the way a man who used it often wore it. I set the axe down and walked back to the cabin, grabbing the Winchester from its pegs just inside the door. "Stay behind me," I said to Anya. She didn't argue but wheeled her cart back into the shadows of the doorway, her hand disappearing under her blanket. I knew she was gripping the knife I'd given her. The rider stopped at the fence line about 30 yards out. He was thin, with a weasel-like face and pale, colorless eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He raised a hand in a gesture that was meant to be friendly but felt like a threat. "Howdy, friend," he called out, his voice thin and reedy. "Name's Silas Kane, just passing through." I didn't answer. I stood on the porch, the rifle held loosely in my hands, its muzzle pointed at the ground. Kane's eyes flicked from me to the shadowed doorway where Anya sat, then back. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Quite a homestead you got here. Lonely place for a man. Unless he's got company." "State your business," I said, my voice flat. "Business? Oh, it's a bit of business. A bit of pleasure," he said, swinging down from his horse. He leaned against the fence, all casual arrogance. "Word gets around even in winter. Word of a Shoshone woman, a warrior they called the Winter Oak, who survived a cavalry skirmish up on the Powder River. A woman who lost her legs but not her life." His eyes bored into me. "Word is her own people left her for dead, and some fool of a rancher took her in." The air grew thick cold. "You hear a lot of stories," I said, my grip tightening on the Winchester. "I do," he agreed cheerfully, "and this one's got a reward attached to it. A bounty. The army wants her for questioning. Says she killed a lieutenant. Seems they don't care if she can walk or not as long as she can talk. Or hang." I felt a surge of cold fury. This man with his sneering smile and greedy eyes was talking about Anya as if she were a piece of property, a sack of coins waiting to be collected. "There's no one here by that name," I said. Kane chuckled, a dry rattling sound. "No pity, because I'm a man who hates a wasted journey." He pushed off from the fence and took a step forward. "Maybe I'll just have a look for myself. Check your hospitality." That's when I raised the rifle, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the silence. "That fence line is as far as you go." His eyes narrowed, the friendly mask dropping away to reveal something cold and reptilian. He looked from the rifle's muzzle to my face. He was weighing his chances, calculating the speed of his draw against the certainty of the bullet. For a long moment, nobody moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then from the shadows of the doorway, Anya spoke. "He is right," she said, her voice clear and carrying laced with contempt. "The woman you seek is dead. She froze in the snow weeks ago." Kane's gaze shifted to her. He couldn't see her clearly, but he could hear the authority in her voice. "And you," he sneered. "Who are you, his squaw?" "I am the woman who will watch him put a bullet in your gut if you take another step," she replied, her voice as cold as the winter wind. There was something in her tone, a complete lack of fear that seemed to give Kane pause. He looked back at me, at the dead certainty in my eyes. He was a predator, but he wasn't a fool. This wasn't an easy prize. "All right, Thorne," he said, spitting my name like a curse. He'd clearly asked around in town. "You keep your secrets, for now." He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off me, and swung himself back onto his horse. "But this ain't over," he snarled. "There's gold in them hills, and there's gold on her head. Someone will be back to collect." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, not fast, but with a deliberate slowness that was its own kind of threat. I didn't lower the rifle until he was a small speck disappearing into the twilight. I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My hands were shaking slightly. I turned and found Anya right behind me, her cart now fully on the porch, the knife in her hand, its blade gleaming in the fading light. "They know," she said, her voice grim. "They've always known," I replied, walking over to her. "They just have a name for their greed now." I knelt in front of her cart, taking the knife from her unresisting fingers. Her hand was ice cold. "He will send others," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Soldiers. Marshals. With paper that makes their violence legal." "Yes," I said again. She looked at me, her eyes dark with a pain that went beyond the threat of Kane. "You should have left me in the snow, Elias. I have brought this curse to your door." "No," I said, taking her hand in mine. "You brought me back to life. There's no curse in that." I looked her straight in the eye. "This is my home. You are here. And I'll burn this whole valley to the ground before I let anyone take you from it." She didn't answer. She just leaned forward, and for the first time it was she who pulled me into a kiss. It wasn't tender. It was fierce, desperate, acclaiming. That night we didn't just make love. We forged an alliance. We drew a line in the snow around this small cabin and dared the world to cross it. The quiet peace of our solitude was shattered. The winter was no longer just a season, it was a siege. And we were in it together. The shadow of Silas Kane's visit lingered long after his tracks had been erased by the wind. A new tension settled over the cabin, a sharp-edged awareness that our isolation was no longer a sanctuary but a vulnerability. We were a tiny island in a vast hostile sea. That night I showed her the root cellar. It was a small cramped space under the floorboards, hidden beneath a bearskin rug where I stored potatoes and preserves. "If they come back," I said, my voice low. "In the lamplight, this is where you'll go." She looked down into the dark, musty space. "To hide like a frightened rabbit, to fight like a fox," I corrected her. "You'll be hidden with a rifle and supplies. You'll have the advantage." A grim understanding dawned in her eyes. "You have thought of this before." "Ever since I brought you here," I admitted. We spent the next 2 days preparing for a war we hoped would never come. We stocked the cellar with water-dried meat ammunition and blankets. I reinforced the cabin door and shuttered the windows with thick planks that could be barred from the inside. Anya from her cart sharpened every knife I owned until they had a razor's edge. She was no longer just a woman I was caring for. She was a strategist, her mind sharp and clear, seeing angles I missed. She was a warrior again. The waiting was the worst part. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a man with a gun. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts. We'd lie awake in the dark, not speaking, just listening, our bodies tuned to the slightest sound. On the third day they came. It was just after dawn. A heavy fog had rolled in, blanketing the valley in a ghostly white shroud. I was on the porch nursing a cup of coffee when I saw them emerge from the mist. 2 riders in blue cavalry coats, their figures blurry and ominous. They weren't riding hard, but with the slow, methodical pace of men who were sure of their authority. "They're here," I said. My voice calm, but my heart began to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm. Anya was already moving. Without a word, she wheeled her cart to the rug, her movements swift and silent. I lifted the heavy trapdoor. She handed me a loaded rifle and a small bundle, then lowered herself into the cellar with a strength that astonished me. "Do not die for me, Elias," she whispered, looking up from the darkness. "I don't plan on it," I said, my voice tight. I slid the door back into place, spread the rug over it, and kicked a little dirt around to make it look natural. By the time they reached the fence, I was sitting in my chair by the cold hearth cleaning the Winchester, the picture of a man with nothing to hide. Morning, the lead soldier called out. He was a sergeant older with a gray-streaked mustache and tired eyes. The other was a young corporal, nervous and shivering in the cold. "Morning, Sergeant," I replied, not getting up. "We're looking for a man named Elias Thorne. You found him?" The sergeant dismounted, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. "We have an order from the territorial marshal. We're searching for a fugitive Shoshone woman. Goes by the name Winter Oak or Anya. We have reason to believe she's in this area." I continued, wiping down the rifle barrel. "Lots of reasons for things out here. Most of them are wrong. Haven't seen any fugitive women. Or any women at all, for that matter." The sergeant's eyes roamed the cabin, taking in the single cot, the sparse furnishings. He was looking for a sign, a piece of clothing, anything out of place. I'd made sure there was nothing to find. "We have orders to search the premises, Thorne," he said, his voice hardening slightly. "We can do this easy or we can do this hard." I shrugged and gestured with the rifle. "Be my guest. Not much to see." My heart was in my throat as they stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under their heavy boots. They walked right over the rug, right over the spot where Anya was hiding, her own heart likely beating as furiously as mine. I could feel her presence beneath my feet, a silent, defiant energy in the earth. They were thorough. They looked in the barn, the shed behind the water barrels. The young corporal even poked his head up the chimney flue. They found nothing. As they were preparing to leave, the sergeant stopped on the porch and turned back to me. "You're sure you haven't seen anyone? A bounty man named Kane passed through town yesterday. Said he saw smoke from this ridge and thought you might have company." "Kane is a liar and a vulture," I said flatly. "He sees what he wants to see. The only company I keep are my own ghosts, Sergeant, and they're not much for conversation." The sergeant held my gaze for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. He nodded curtly. "All right, Thorne. Sorry to have troubled you." They mounted their horses and disappeared back into the fog as silently as they had come. I waited. I forced myself to wait a full hour, my body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. I made coffee, I stoked the fire, I did a dozen small normal things while Anya lay in the dark beneath my feet. Finally, I could wait no longer. I pulled back the rug and lifted the door. She was sitting in the darkness, the rifle across her lap, her face pale but composed. I reached down, and she took my hand. I pulled her up her body light as I lifted her out of the cellar and into the light. She didn't speak. She just came into my arms, her face buried against my chest, her body shaking with a silent, racking tremor. I held her, my own relief so profound it felt like a physical pain. "You did not blink," she finally whispered against my shirt. "You did not make a sound," I replied, my voice rough with emotion. We stood there for a long time, just holding on. The threat had passed for now. They had come and they had found nothing. We had faced the world and we had won. That evening, a fragile peace returned to the cabin. The shutters were opened, the bars taken down. Anya took a small, sharp piece of bone and began to carve. I watched her, the firelight playing on her focused expression. Later, as we lay in the cot, the warmth of our bodies a shield against the cold, she pressed something hard into my hand. It was a ring carved from bone with a simple interlocking design. "In my tribe," she said softly, "when a woman gives a man a ring she has made, it means he is her home. That his heart is her shelter." I slid the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly. "I never thought I'd have a home again," I whispered, my voice thick. She touched my face, her fingers tracing the lines of my jaw. We built one Elias, out of snow and silence. And for the first time since the fire, since I had walled my heart in with grief, I felt the stones begin to crumble. She wasn't a ghost I had invited in. She was the one who was chasing my own ghosts away. The fall spring of March arrived with a deceptive gentleness. The iron grip of winter loosened. The snowpack began to recede from the southern slopes. And for a few hours each afternoon, the sun had a hint of genuine warmth. The world felt like it was taking its first deep breath after being submerged for too long. A sense of peace, hard-won and fragile, had settled in our small cabin. We had been tested, and we had endured. The fear of discovery hadn't vanished, but it had retreated to the back of our minds, replaced by the steady, quiet rhythm of our life together. We spoke more not of the past, but of the future. Small things. Mending the roof, planting a small garden come summer, buying another horse. We were building a life not with grand promises, but with the small, sturdy bricks of shared days. One afternoon, when the sun was high and the air was still, I hitched Jericho to the old buckboard wagon. I laid a thick mattress of hay and blankets in the back. "Where are we going?" Anya asked from the porch, a curious tilt to her head. "You've seen my world from the inside," I said. "It's time you saw it from the outside." Getting her into the wagon was easier now. She was stronger, and we moved together with an unspoken understanding. As we rode out, leaving the familiar confines of the ranch behind, for the first time I saw a new light in her eyes. It was a look of wonder, of rediscovery. She took in the snow-capped peaks of the Laramie Range, the vast expanse of the valley, the dark green of the pines, as if seeing them for the first time. I took her to a place I hadn't visited in 5 years. A small secluded meadow where a creek, now mostly frozen, snaked through a stand of ancient cottonwood trees. Their bare branches reached for the sky like skeletal fingers. I carried her from the wagon and set her down on a thick blanket under the largest of the trees. "I used to come here," I said, my voice quiet with my daughter. The words felt strange in my mouth, like a foreign language I'd almost forgotten. Anya didn't speak. She just reached out and took my hand, her presence a silent, solid support. Her name was Mara, I found myself saying. She had her mother's smile. She loved this place. She'd chase the butterflies in summer and try to catch the minnows in the creek. I paused, the memories washing over me, sharp and painful, but no longer debilitating. She was 4 when the fire. My voice broke. I hadn't spoken her name aloud to another soul since the day I buried what little was left of her. Anya's grip on my hand tightened. "Tell me about her," she whispered. And so I did. I told her about Mara's laugh, about the way she'd pull on my beard, about the small, clumsy drawings she'd make. I told her about Sarah, about her kindness, her strength, about the way the cabin had felt empty of light the moment she was gone. I spoke for a long time, the words spilling out, cleansing a wound that had festered in silence for too long. Anya listened, her dark eyes filled with a deep, unwavering empathy. She didn't offer empty platitudes or pity. She just listened. She bore witness to my grief. When I was done, a profound quiet settled between us. The sun was warm on our faces. "Thank you," I said, my voice hoarse. "For what?" "For listening." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "A burden shared is a burden halved, Elias. My people have known this for 1,000 winters." I looked at her then, at this incredible woman who had endured so much, who had lost everything, and still possessed a spirit as strong and unyielding as the mountains around us. The bone ring she had given me was warm on my finger. "Anya," I began, my heart full. This life, it's not much. It's quiet and it's hard. It is real," she interrupted softly. "And it is ours." She pulled a small leather pouch from her belt. From it she took another carved object. It was a pendant shaped like an oak leaf, intricate and beautiful. "The winter oak does not break in the blizzard," she said, her voice soft but strong. "It bends. It endures. It waits for the sun. You are my son, Elias." She held it out to me. It wasn't a proposal, not in the way my people understood it. It was something more profound. It was an acceptance, a declaration. I took the pendant, its smooth, polished surface cool in my palm. "And you," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I could no longer name, "are the reason the sun is worth waiting for." I leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss that held no desperation, no fear. It was a kiss of certainty, of peace. It was the promise of 1,000 more sunrises, of a garden in the summer, of a life rebuilt from the ashes. We returned to the cabin as the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered valley in hues of orange and pink. That night, as we lay by the fire, her head on my chest, the silence was different yet again. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of grief, nor the tense, watchful silence of fear. It was the deep, comfortable, and abiding silence of home. The winter was ending, and for the first time in a very long time, I was not afraid of the spring. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.